On November 14, 1942, a single American battleship, considered obsolete by her own admirals, charged headfirst into a vastly superior enemy fleet in complete darkness and executed a perfect unseen kill that saved the entire Guadalcanal campaign. At 2300 hours on that fateful night, the radar operators aboard the USS Washington tracked 9 Japanese warships, invisible to the naked eye, moving through the pitch-black waters north of Guadalcanal. The enemy force, still relying on searchlights and binoculars, had no idea an American battleship was watching their every move, thanks to Washington's revolutionary SG surface search radar and Mark III fire control radar. This technology allowed the Washington to fight blind and kill what she could not see. For months, her crew had trained relentlessly with this equipment, which was considered impossible at the time. However, official naval doctrine in November 1942 dictated that battleships were obsolete, merely expensive escorts or anti-aircraft platforms reduced to protecting carriers. Since Pearl Harbor, fast battleships like Washington had been forbidden to seek surface engagements, restricted only to defensive roles. Washington, the second ship of the North Carolina class, was an engineering masterpiece, displacing 44,800 tons fully loaded and capable of hurling 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells over 20 miles with her 9 16-inch guns. Yet, in the twisted logic of 1942, she was considered too valuable to risk in the very ship-to-ship combat she was designed for. The tragic cost of this doctrine had been paid in blood just 3 nights earlier when Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led Task Force 67 into the same waters without battleship support to intercept a Japanese bombardment force. The Navy's only 2 operational battleships in the South Pacific, Washington and South Dakota, were being held back to screen the sole functional American carrier, the damaged Enterprise. Callahan's force, lacking the heavy protection and firepower, stumbled into Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group, which included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. The ensuing chaos, which became known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, was a barroom brawl in the darkness, where ships fired at point-blank range and American ships even shot at each other. When the fighting ended, 2 American admirals, Callahan and Scott, were dead. The cruisers Atlanta and Juno were sinking or lost, and 4 destroyers were sunk. 706 Americans were dead, while the Japanese had lost only 2 destroyers, although the battleship Hiei was crippled and later sunk. With the Marines on Guadalcanal barely holding Henderson Field and intelligence reporting an even larger Japanese force heading south to pound the airbase into rubble, Admiral Chester Nimitz faced an impossible choice. Doctrine screamed, "Never risk battleships without carrier support," and war games predicted that battleships operating alone at night were doomed. But the Marines were out of time. Nimitz made the hardest decision of his career, ordering Admiral William Halsey to release the battleships, to send them in alone to fight ship to ship, declaring, "Doctrine be damned." The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr., an unlikely warrior who looked more like a rural schoolteacher than an admiral. Despite his perpetually disheveled appearance, Lee was one of the finest tactical minds in the U.S. Navy and an unparalleled marksman, having won 5 gold medals at the 1920 Olympics. He understood ballistics with an instinctive, perfect intuition that translated seamlessly from rifles to the 16-inch naval guns. Crucially, Lee was one of the few admirals who truly understood and embraced radar, recognizing it not as a novelty but as a revolution in naval warfare. He knew that a radar-equipped ship could dominate a battlefield where the enemy was fighting blind. For 6 months, Lee had drilled his crews relentlessly with radar-directed gunnery, eliminating the chain of command middlemen to wire radar operators directly to the gunnery officer and gun directors. This system, developed through hundreds of hours of drilling, was an untested revolution in fire control. Lee's Task Force 64 consisted of his flagship Washington, the newly arrived and green battleship South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. It was a scratch team that had never worked together and only had one day to prepare. Making matters worse, the two battleships had incompatible radio systems, forcing Lee to jury-rig a communication plan using signal lights. The destroyers, armed only for close-range knife fights, were dangerously outgunned against the Japanese cruisers and battleships. Lee knew the formidable threat they faced, Admiral Nobutake Kondo's force of 14 ships, centered on the veteran battleship Kirishima, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Japanese were masters of night fighting, selected for superhuman night vision and armed with the deadly Type 93 long lance torpedo that could break a cruiser in half with one hit. American sailors had learned to fear the night. The darkness belonged to the Japanese. But Lee had a powerful, unexpected advantage. He had radar, and he knew how to use it.
As Task Force 64 moved through Iron Bottom Sound, Washington's radar operators tracked every contact, seeing the enemy coming from 20 miles away, far beyond visual range. At 22:15, radar detected the first enemy ships, a group of destroyers closing from 18,000 yards. Lee faced a critical dilemma: open fire at maximum range and risk the Japanese aborting their mission, or wait, let them commit, and spring an ambush at closer range. He bet everything on Japanese overconfidence, knowing they were expecting only light resistance, not American battleships. He ordered his ships to hold fire and maintain course. The range closed to 10,000 yards. The massive silhouettes of the battleships should have been spotted, but the Japanese lookouts were focused on Guadalcanal, expecting the flashes of their own bombardment. At 2300 hours exactly, at 8,000 yards, Lee gave the order to open fire. Washington's first salvo of 9 16-inch radar-directed shells arched through the darkness toward the light cruiser Sendai. The second salvo shifted to a more dangerous target, the destroyer leading the Japanese van. Washington's guns did not miss this time. At least one 16-inch shell slammed into the destroyer, blowing her machinery spaces apart and leaving her burning furiously and dead in the water. The night immediately exploded into chaos. Disaster struck moments later at 23:07 when South Dakota suffered a massive electrical failure as her chief engineer accidentally threw the main circuit breakers. Every electrical system, including radar, lights, and gun directors, died instantly. Reduced to a floating target, the crippled battleship was immediately illuminated by searchlights from Kirishima and the Japanese cruisers. Every Japanese ship opened fire, and in 90 seconds, South Dakota took 27 hits from 14 and 8-inch shells, destroying her radar and secondary battery. Meanwhile, the American destroyers, charging forward to launch torpedoes, were being annihilated. Preston was caught in a crossfire, detonated, and sank with 117 men. Woke took shells and a long-lance torpedo, breaking in half and sinking in minutes. Benham's bow was blown off by a torpedo. In less than 15 minutes, Lee's screen was gone. By 23:15, only Washington remained operational, alone facing 14 Japanese ships, including the enemy battleship and 4 cruisers. Every tactical manual dictated an immediate withdrawal, but Willis Lee saw something the Japanese could not. In their excitement over destroying South Dakota and the American destroyers, the Japanese had lost their formation and, crucially, had not noticed Washington, which was hidden behind the burning wrecks. Lee had an opportunity that would violate every principle of battleship combat. He would charge alone into the middle of the enemy fleet. He gave the defining order: maximum speed ahead, complete radio silence. Washington accelerated to 26 knots, heading straight for the Japanese battle line. The Japanese, their searchlights focused on the burning South Dakota on the horizon, still did not see Washington. At 8,400 yards, practically point-blank range for battleship guns, Lee gave the order to open fire on Kirishima. Washington's entire main battery, 9 16-inch radar-directed shells erupted in a perfectly coordinated radar-directed salvo. The second salvo was a direct hit. In 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 16-inch shells, with at least 9, possibly as many as 20, slamming into Kirishima's flagship. The 2,700-pound shells hit with the force of freight trains, punching through Kirishima's armor like tissue paper. A shell destroyed her forward turret, another detonated in her engine room, and a third hit below the waterline. Her steering was smashed, jamming her rudder hard to port, forcing her to circle helplessly. Washington's secondary battery also rained over 100 shells into Kirishima's superstructure, setting her on fire from stem to stern. Admiral Kondo, watching his flagship burn, was ambushed and still did not know how many American ships he was facing. His cruisers finally illuminated Washington and launched a spread of 16 Longlands torpedoes, but the American battleship, her radar tracking the incoming threats, turned away and avoided every one. Kondo, realizing he was now the hunted, ordered an immediate withdrawal. The most powerful Japanese surface force to approach Guadalcanal since the invasion began turned and fled into the night. Behind them, Kirishima's damage control was hopeless. At 0100 on November 15, her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship, and at 3:20 hours, she rolled over and sank northwest of Savo Island. Kirishima was the first battleship sunk by another battleship in the Pacific War, destroyed by a single American ship fighting alone. The full extent of the American victory became clear at dawn. Japanese troop transports, caught in the open, were swarmed by aircraft from Henderson Field. 7 were sunk. Only 4,000 of the 11,000 Japanese reinforcements reached shore without most of their equipment. The final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal had failed, and the tide of the campaign had turned decisively. The cost was 3 destroyers sunk or lost, and over 400 Americans killed, but the Japanese were stopped cold. One statistic stood out as almost unbelievable. USS Washington, which had single-handedly defeated a Japanese battleship and driven off an entire enemy fleet, suffered no casualties. Not a single man aboard had been killed or seriously wounded by enemy action, and the ship herself took only one non-critical hit, a 5-inch shell that cut her radio antenna. It was unprecedented, a testament to the ship's construction, the crew's superb training, and Admiral Lee's tactical genius.
Despite the magnitude of the victory, the official Navy response was muted. The battle was classified as a defensive action, and Lee's after-action report, which emphasized the critical importance of radar, was filed away. The battleship admirals would not admit the carrier advocates were wrong, and the carrier admirals would not concede that battleships still had offensive value. Washington's victory was minimized, treated as an anomaly rather than a validation of new tactics. Lee was philosophical, stating that the only important thing was that Guadalcanal had been saved. However, he was privately frustrated by the Navy's failure to learn, writing detailed reports on radar-directed fire control and new night-fighting tactics, most of which were ignored or implemented half-heartedly. The Japanese Navy's response was confusion and denial, with Admiral Kondo initially claiming American cruisers and destroyers had sunk Kirishima, refusing to believe a single battleship could have destroyed his flagship and driven off his entire force. The psychological impact, once Washington's role was confirmed, was profound. The night, which had belonged to the Japanese since Pearl Harbor, was no longer safe. Japanese doctrine began to shift, realizing American radar had neutralized their advantage in night fighting. Washington went on to earn 13 battle stars, but she would never again be allowed to prove what she had that night. The Navy kept her tied to the carriers, using her anti-aircraft battery to protect the flat tops and her main guns for shore bombardment. The true tragedy was not her restriction, which was understandable, but that the lessons of her victory were deliberately ignored. Lee's demonstration of radar-equipped battleships dominating night surface combat and his tactics that could have saved lives in later battles were rejected by a Navy bureaucracy committed to the primacy of carrier aviation. Lee continued to advocate for the integration of radar and surface warfare until his death from a heart attack on August 25, 1945, just 10 days after Japan surrendered. The man who had revolutionized battleship warfare and saved Guadalcanal died as the war he helped win came to an end. Even in death, his achievements were minimized in his obituary. Washington was decommissioned in 1947, sat in the reserve fleet for 14 years, and was finally sold for scrap in 1961. No memorial was erected. The battleship that saved Guadalcanal was reduced to razor blades and reinforcing bars.
Today, her achievement remains largely unknown outside naval history circles. Yet the legacy of Washington and Willis Lee lives on. The Aegis combat system that protects modern American warships is a direct descendant of the radar fire control system Lee pioneered. The integration of sensors and weapons and the tactical principles he developed, engaging beyond visual range and fighting the enemy where he is blind, are the very foundations of modern naval combat. Lee was right about everything. Battleships with radar could have dominated surface combat throughout the war, saving lives and winning battles more decisively. But institutional inertia prevented the Navy from learning the lessons Washington taught until the battleship era was already over. Washington's story has one final, powerful detail. Throughout her entire combat career, through 13 major engagements, she never lost a single crew member to enemy action. No other major warship in any navy can make that claim. This perfect record was not luck, but the result of superb training, strength of construction, and the revolutionary tactics of Willis Lee, who understood that the best way to protect his men was to kill the enemy before they could kill them. By engaging at maximum radar range and striking from unexpected angles, Washington avoided the bloody close-range battles that claimed so many other ships. Washington's story illuminates a persistent pattern in military history. Revolutionary advantages are often discovered by practical men in desperate circumstances, not by theorists in war colleges, and the establishment often resists until the evidence becomes overwhelming or irrelevant. As the U.S. Navy faces new challenges today, the lesson of Washington becomes crucial once more. The service that adapts fastest to new technology, listens to its operators, and values results over doctrine will dominate future naval battles. A single battleship, written off by doctrine, commanded by an admiral who looked like a school teacher, using technology most officers did not understand, saved the first American offensive of the Pacific War. That victory was then deliberately minimized because it challenged the dominant narrative of carrier supremacy. Her story reminds us that the greatest victories often come from the most unexpected sources, that bureaucracies resist change, even when lives depend on it, and that the price of institutional blindness is always paid by those who serve. Washington deserves better than obscurity. Her lessons deserve to be studied, understood, and applied. This November marks 82 years since Washington proved that courage, technology, and leadership could overcome any odds.